In the last video, we started looking at what modernity was, and what we said was that we can understand modernity as a revolution in the sense of total transformation, which is akin to saying that modernity is a civilizational change. Civilizational change. Now, I want to talk a bit more about this, not the change itself as such, but the nature of change or total transformation. So, what we said last time was that revolution or total change or transformation, whether it's at civilizational level or not, if it is a revolution, it normally would consist of two horns, so to speak. So you have long changes happening in a society over centuries. And those long changes can be, if it is a civilizational change, those long changes are going to be in every aspect of life. Can be in a conception of self, for example, how people see them or understand them. It would also be changes in social relations and how we relate to each other and norms and values around that. They can be epistemological changes. Your conception of knowledge changes. Then you can have philosophical or metaphysical changes. Your worldview changes. Then political changes, the relationship between power and its justification, and the relationship between the centers of power and society and centers of power and individual, etc., etc. So you have changes happening, and they happen over a long period of time. And when we are trying to understand a revolution or civilizational change, we can conceive of an outline, but what actually happens, we have to do empirical work for that. But this broad conception of long changes in a society must happen for a long time in order for civilizational change to occur. And the second horn is events. So these changes, culminate in spectacular moments or events, which are generally people associate those with revolution. But those events, though they are very important, they can't happen without the background of long and more profound changes. And if those profound changes are not happening, then really what would be happening would not be a revolution, but more of a reform or a coup and things like that. Or superficial change, which is mistaken for a revolution or etc. But those civilizational changes, then culminate in events, and those events can happen over time. So, so you have Russian Revolution, so October 1917. That's an event, when they stormed and actually took over the government. But if Russian Revolution was actually a revolution, then that event was just a culmination of much profound changes within Russian society. Similarly, the event of Iranian Revolution, for example, the return of Imam Khomeini to Tehran from Paris, that's one event, and there are many other events. But if Iranian Revolution was a profound revolution at certain level, then it must have gone through a lot of changes. Um, and to understand civilizational change, to understand a revolution or civilizational change, we need to understand both these aspects, events, and profound changes. Um, and without understanding these both sides of the story, it's very our understanding of modernity would be very skewed. Um, so that's one aspect which I wanted to sort of reiterate and talk about it a bit more in a bit more depth. So when a change in a society happens, that change requires long-term profound changes. And depending on the actual revolution and its depth, those changes are at every level in society. The level of self, at the level of social relation, at the level of political relations, at the level of epistemology, etc., etc. And then those are necessarily manifested in events through which, actual transition from the old civilization to the new civilization happens. The important thing in this is that these long-term changes are happening within the existing society. They are happening within an existing society, and they happen for a long, long time. So, within an existing society, a new conception of knowledge, which is not a dominant conception of knowledge, would emerge, and it will become stronger, and it would be institutionalized. For example, within existing society, you see different economic institutions emerging, led by different people. At the margin of that society, of course, but they will become stronger and stronger to the extent that when they are strong enough, they would overwhelm the existing institution, and then you would see those events, spectacular events happening. So that's very, very important. So these long-term changes happen within the womb of the existing, and that's the Marxist word or the way of, I think, and it's very important. Marx, I think somewhere he says that. So he's talking about obviously Marxist revolution, but I'm sort of generalizing it to all revolution. And what he says is the higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured. And his words are, in the womb of the old society itself. Okay? And that's very important. And so a new society which supposedly one day would replace the existing society, if there is going to be a revolution, obviously, develop within the womb of the existing society or old society itself. That's why Marx says that you can't have socialism without some sort of socialist institution developing within the margin, within the womb of the old, that is capitalist society in this sense. Otherwise you would have just political movement, and they would They may lead to superficial changes, but they are never going to be able to culminate in profound revolution, let alone a revolution at civilizational level. So that's very important. That's, I think, can't be emphasized enough. Okay, so let's take it. So, but why does revolution occur? Why can't we have end of history, as some people have said? And maybe we are living in an end of history. And even those people who are talking about the collapse of this capitalist civilization, they are not sure whether there's any alternative going to emerge at the end of the tunnel, because they don't see any alternatives developing within the womb of the existing capitalist society. Anyway, so for example, if you study Wolfgang Streeck, for example, he's a political economist, German political economist. I think he's Adorno's student, but I'm not sure about that. So, for example, in his book, how capitalism will end, or something like that, he says that capitalism actually will wither away, and people won't even realize it, because there isn't going to be any revolution, because there's nothing else, emerging which can replace. So some people believe that. So it's not necessary that there is a revolution. But if a revolution happens, then it's a good question. I mean, natural question to ask: why does a revolution happen? And obviously, there are revolutions in history. We have seen. We had. We had Roman civilization. I mean, we had Greek civilization, Iranian civilization. They were never a totally universal civilization, but Roman civilization was quite, even though it wasn't a universal civilization like modern Western civilization. I mean, universal in its actual expense. So we had Greek civilization, and we had Iranians, and then we. So we had Roman civilization, then it was replaced by Christian civilization, we had Muslim civilization, and now we have modern Western civilization. So revolution do happen. So at the civilizational level. So why do revolution happen? And that's an interesting question. Now, why do revolution happen? Why? And also who are the agents of revolution? Who are the agents of revolutions? And do the revolution even need agents? Or even if we have agents, do they control the changes in history, or they are being used by historical march of history as old political economists like Adam Smith would call cunning of reason, or Hegel called it cunning of reason. Adam Smith called it the hidden hand, or something like that. So these are all interesting questions. So let's start with, why do revolution happen? Obviously, we don't have an answer to this, but we try to come up with something. So one of the things which I think is important is I mean, it may not happen in every revolution, but to like Hegel and Marx, and Marx is basically just borrowing from Hegel and inverting his thing. So Hegel is the main person there. I think his conception is that a civilization when it becomes internally incoherent or self-contradictory, then it ultimately collapses. So there can be inconsistencies, but those inconsistencies, if they become, self-contradiction, then society cannot survive. That's Hegel's conception in a nutshell. So that's why we can say that his conception of history is rational in that sense. And Marx sort of borrows from Hegel in that Hegel's focus is on ideas or self-conception of civilization. On the other hand, Marx applied this to material conditions. So if we take an example from Marx, the example of a civilization which has become sort of self-contradictory would be like capitalist civilization, in the sense that, this is just very rough and very superficial, but just to make the point. So the purpose of capitalists, you have capitalism, you have capitalist, and these are private property, supposed to be anyway. So they own capital, and capital is anything which the sole purpose of which is to actually make something more. That's what definition of capital is. So for example, if you have an apple and you buy it so you can eat it, this apple is not capital. That's a consumer good. But if you buy apple with the sole purpose that you can buy more apple, and sell and make more money, so then apple become capital in that sense. So generally machine would be called capital, because the purpose of machine is to make more products of people. But my definition is more a bit broader. So anyway, this is not the point time to talk about Marx as such, but I was just taking it as an example. So capitalism, so you have private capitalists, they are accumulating money or accumulating capital, and more capital you accumulate, capital become concentrated, huge concentration of capital. Like nowadays you see, Twitter, supposed to be a private company, but it's so powerful that it can kick off American president from, Twitter. So, although it is owned by private capitalists, one or two or few, it's actually huge concentration. Same you can say about Amazon, for example, or other things. So monopolies emerge, and those monopolies create a contradiction in the sense that in the capital system you had a private capitalist accumulating money or capital, and now you have private capitalists, but they are accumulating money, which is accumulating capital, which is monopolistic and cannot really be managed by private capitalists, even though they will try to hang on to it. That's Marx's point anyway. So there's a mismatch between these individualist capital and the actual capital accumulation, which is so huge that it is beyond the control of a private person. So those private persons end up becoming proxy governments or proxy states, and they manage capital for their own benefit rather than for the benefit of humanity as a whole. So the contradiction is this: although the actual accumulation of capital is social in the sense that monopolistic, everybody is actually contributing to it, but its main benefit is going to private capitalists. And either capitalism can reform itself and it can try to overcome this inconsistency, or if it doesn't do it, then according to Marx, this capitalism, this contradiction would lead to, or should lead to, the collapse of capitalism, and we will have a more coherent system in which, rather than private capital or private capitalists, you would have a state, for example, which is big enough to look after huge monopolies and gear the benefit for everybody, in theory at least. So that's the contradiction. So that's the Marxist. So then capitalism will collapse because of the fact that it has internal inconsistencies which lead to contradictions within, and if contradictions are not resolved, you have revolution. Hegel's examples are more to do with self-conception or ideas, and I don't think he ignores material condition, but his focus is not material condition, because for him rationality and ideas are more important. So in his different books like Phenomenology of Spirit, for example, or Phenomenology of Mind, whatever you want to translate it into, you have an example of master and slave dialect. And he talks about contradiction there, or in Greek civilization, you look at the Greek tragedy, for example, Sophocles' work, for example, and see contradiction in his Greek civilization, for example, and that contradiction is not resolved within that civilization, so that's why that civilization collapses and it transforms into, or it replaced by more coherent civilization. Similarly, master-slave dialect, that collapses, and you have transformation into a more seemingly more system. It's a more coherent system, like Christianity, for example. So I won't go into these actual what was the contradiction, but I might pick up this in the later videos. But what I wanted to say was that according to Marx and Hegel, at least, revolution happened because of internal contradiction within a civilization or within an institution. Internal contradiction. And according to Hegel, those are more rationality based contradictions. According to Marx, they are centered on material condition. That's not the main point. The main point is the revolutions happen when a civilization develop contradiction within itself, and contradiction doesn't necessarily lead to a collapse of civilization. A civilization, if it has resources within itself, it can gather itself and try to reform itself and try to remove those contradictions. But if those contradictions don't resolve themselves, then that civilization collapses. So this is, it doesn't exhaust the explanation, but it gives us one very powerful idea. We don't have to be Hegelian or Marxist to use this idea of internal contradiction of a civilization for understanding revolution or transition from Christianity to modernity. One last point I want to make is, and I think I will develop this in next videos, that you don't have to have necessarily an agent of revolution as such, or one agent of a revolution, or people don't have to be consciously working for those revolutions. At some point it become obvious and people start self-consciously become self-conscious of what is happening. But so for example, when Luther presented his thesis, or he rebelled against the Catholic hierarchy, I don't think he was thinking of a civilizational revolution or he was looking for some sort of revolution or reform within church. But those actions can lead to because once you, as Foucault I think somewhere says that you are free to, I think something like that, he says that you are free to say whatever you want to say, for example, but once you have said something, so for example, once I've made this video and now I don't have any control over what I have said, and they can take any form. They can stimulate someone, they can depress someone, so Luther did whatever he did, but he didn't have any control over various consequences of his action, which were felt throughout the history of Europe, and led to many other civilizational changes, which ultimately led to a revolution at the civilizational level, which gave us our modernity. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop here, and we'll see. We'll pick up these points in the next video. Thank you.